The most famous Boleyns of the Tudor period were undoubtedly Anne Boleyn, who became the second wife of King Henry VIII, Mary Boleyn, who would become the king's mistress, and George Boleyn, who would famously lose his head being implicated in the same scandal as his sister, Anne, when she was the queen. However, it is known that there were at least 2 other Boleyn children, and the evidence for this is scarce inside of history books. But their deaths are recorded, and there are graves for them. In around 1498, Thomas Boleyn married Lady Elizabeth Howard, and these would of course become the parents of the Boleyn children. It's not known exactly when they married, and Thomas Boleyn would later state, "When I married, I had only £50 a year to live on for me and my wife, as long as my father lived, and yet she brought me every year a child." He liked to think himself as a self-made man, and Thomas Boleyn was rather power-obsessed. He wanted more influence and wealth for himself, and many of the reasons at the time Tudor nobles were having children was to guarantee power and wealth for years to come if their children married into certain families. The Boleyns, of course, would become the most famous or infamous family of Henry VIII's time, and despite their incredibly high rise to prominence in society, they would fall sharply from grace with the swing of the executioner's axe. But Thomas Boleyn would father many children with his wife, and Elizabeth, his wife, fell pregnant rather quickly. There are at least 5 Boleyn children. But what occurred to the other Boleyns that are not the most well known? Inside of a small church in Penshurst, named St. John the Baptist Church, there is a small brass cross on the floor over a burial slab. This writes, "Thomas Boleyn, the son of Sir Thomas Boleyn." This is inside of the Sydney Chapel, close to another monument, and it's easy to miss, but this is the evidence we have about another Boleyn son. Also inside of St. Peter's Church in Hever, near to the family home of Hever Castle, there is also another little tomb slab commemorating a Boleyn boy. This is for Henry Boleyn, and it is marked in the same manner with a small cross. And this grave in the floor is next to the head of Sir Thomas Boleyn's tomb. But both of these grave markers are very small, and they're not big, and this could indicate that the 2 Boleyn sons, Thomas named after his father, and Henry named after the king, could have been very small or young when they died. These must have also lived, as at the time during the Tudor period, children who were born still were not normally named or memorialised, and these boys must also have been baptised to have been buried inside of the church in such places of prominence. So they are likely to have lived for, if not months or years. It's not known whereabouts these children were born in relation to the other Boleyns, but Thomas was most probably the eldest, if not the eldest son, due to the tradition of naming the eldest son after the father. Henry could have been younger, but most historians question what happened to these Boleyn sons. Many have concluded, like we have, that they most probably died when they were very young or in their infancy. There are other suggestions that the boys, Thomas and Henry, lived longer and into adulthood, but the historical records about their lives are not the most known. Alison Weir states of this that Thomas Boleyn was buried in Penshurst Church, and that his tomb is marked by a brass cross and the date 1520. The inscription on the brass reads, "Thomas Boleyn, son of Sir Thomas Boleyn." That must date the brass to after June 1509, when the elder Thomas was knighted. Brasses were often small, even for adults, so the size of the brass does not necessarily indicate that Thomas Boleyn died in infancy. Indeed, he's likely to have been the eldest son, and if he was the son who went to Oxford University at 17, then he must have been born in the mid to late 1490s. After perhaps studying at Oxford, it is possible that he entered the household of the Duke of Buckingham, which might explain his burial at Penshurst. Buckingham, of course, was executed in 1521. It's possible that these brothers both lived into early manhood. It may even have been Henry who went to Oxford. 2 cross brasses of similar date might indicate that they died around the same time, possibly from the same cause. In 1517, for example, there was a severe epidemic of the sweating sickness, which caused high mortality in England. notably in Oxford and Cambridge. There are some issues with this, especially as there is no evidence of Thomas or Henry Boleyn being adults. They are not recorded in admissions into universities such as Oxford, unlike their brother George, but what is captivating is when their father would have planned for them. It's most likely that the power-obsessed father would have wanted his eldest son at court with him, and Anne and Mary would be sent across to France to gain power. But there was a Master Boleyn who did attend a court function and party with his father, but this could have been stated to have been George Boleyn, who would secure power at court. As mentioned, accounts about the two lost Boleyn boys are not available, and the most conclusive evidence as to what happened to the pair exists in the fact their bodies are marked with small brass plaques and crosses. These would usually be used to commemorate simpler burials of infants, and many children would not have any form of grave marker. But of course Thomas Boleyn was rather important at the time. When adults died, their grave markers usually contained more information, or a snippet of religious devotion or prayer, but the small size of the slabs also indicate a small burial taking place. The Boleyns as a family, around the 1520s, could also afford larger monuments if the two boys had lived longer and had been past infancy. During the Tudor times, childbirth and raising children was often incredibly dangerous, as the healthcare and facilities to deliver and raise a child was not as it is today. It's believed that around 1/3 of children born in the 16th century would die before the age of 5, and only around half of those born would survive to get to adulthood. But the common practice to do with children who did not make it, even those who were of royal birth, was to bury them in unmarked graves quietly in certain places. For example, even King Henry VIII would suffer this sort of anguish, as the great hope for the nation, Henry the Duke of Cornwall, his first son, would die before he was 2 months old. The huge celebrations would only have finished before the king was informed of his son dying in the royal nursery. Henry the Duke of Cornwall was given a large funeral, which was befitting, as his role as the king's son, but he would be buried in Westminster Abbey in an unmarked grave which is not entirely precise in its location. Memorials did mark infant burials, but these were usually very plain and simple. But the Boleyn family could have had these installed a while after the deaths of the two boys, especially after they came into money when Anne would marry Henry VIII. This would explain why the brass markers are also rather similar and could have been done at the same time. But one strange thing is why Thomas Boleyn, their presumably eldest son, was buried in Penshurst and not at the family home of Hever Castle. This could have been because of Hever Castle being done up and decorated and renovated at the time, and the Boleyns could have been staying at Penshurst when Thomas died, and rather than repatriate his body back home to Hever once work had been done, it was found more fitting to lay him to rest there. The decision to exhume him later would also have been considered inappropriate. Hever Castle was renovated towards the start of the 16th century, and this would back up the idea that Thomas was the eldest son too. However, Sir Thomas Boleyn, the father, would later have his tomb placed right next to that of his infant son Henry. But the state of the lost Boleyn brothers is a captivating one, and it's one that no doubt caused heartbreak and upset for the family. Thomas Boleyn always dreamed of his children securing power and wealth for him, and further prestige for the family, and when Anne became interlocked with the king, her father urged her not to pass up this opportunity. But Anne Boleyn, the executed Queen of England, could have had two brothers who also had a very tragic end, meaning that the sole survivor of the Boleyn children was in fact Mary, whose life was also dominated with scandal, as she became the mistress to Henry VIII. Thank you for watching, and to support, please subscribe to Her Remarkable History. Thank you.